So hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Nadia.
And I'm Jodie.
And we both work within the Sustainability and Foresight team, and we're here to tell you about the climate emergency and how you can monitor your energy bills to reduce your carbon emissions and hopefully save you money.
So just a reminder before we get started, if you want to put us on pause whilst you get any of your energy bills ready to go, because at the end of this presentation, we'll give a bit of a tutorial about how to use a monitoring tool using your bills.
So the purpose of why we're here today is to raise greater awareness on the relevance of climate change and why it should be important to your organisation or parish, as well as Jersey as a whole. We hope to empower you to better understand your operational greenhouse gas emissions by accounting for your energy bills. And we hope that you come away from our webinar feeling motivated to continue with your energy monitoring and adopt more sustainable practices within your organisations to continue to make more energy savings. So in terms of the benefits of completing this webinar, the spreadsheet that we provide is designed to help you monitor your energy use, costs, and by extension, your associated carbon. So by understanding your current energy use, this workshop will give you the potential to save money by prioritising how to reduce your energy use, measure success of any measures you put in place, reducing your emissions, and then overall helping to respond to the climate emergency. So when monitoring bills, we're able to see at which sites money is being spent. And one successful example we have is one parish reported that they noticed money was being spent at a building they no longer occupied, but realised a street light had been left running that they no longer needed. And this was able to be quickly corrected after studying their bills in a little more detail.
So COVID-19 is what we've all been talking about for the last year. It's had a huge impact on all of our lives, both personally and as organisations. And the last year has been really hard for many, and money is exceptionally tight. However, the pandemic also brought a new appreciation for nature and our natural world, and people really value being surrounded by beautiful green and blue spaces here in Jersey when there is little else to do. Comparisons have also been made between this health crisis and the climate crisis, as it's really shone light on the fact that organisations must become more resilient to external pressures, and this will only become more and more apparent as we see climate change in action. So we hope that through talking to you today about monitoring and energy consumption, we can have a conversation on both saving money and living and working in more sustainable ways. So it's a win-win. So just how we look now at the final outcomes that we hope to see after this webinar. So this is the look of the monitoring tool that you should already have in front of you, which is just a blank sheet at the moment. Just to reiterate, if you don't have this monitoring tool and you would like it, we'll put our contact details on the end slide and we can send that to you. We've got one available for parishes, one for businesses, and one to use domestically. So we hope to go from that blank sheet to this one here with all this information filled in. So let's zoom in to look at this in more detail. At the end, you should be presented with some graphs, and you don't have to do anything fancy to create these. They'll be created for you just from simply inputting the data. So hopefully we've done most of the hard work for you. So this one here shows emissions split by fuel type. So we can see here that our main emissions are coming from oil, and that might be the main source of fuels at the sites that we've got. And we might think about when the opportunity arises for us to make the switch, we might think about switching from something other than oil. The next slide here shows the split in terms of monetary value. And using some sample data, this graph shows us that most of our money is being spent on electricity. So depending what you know about your sites and how much usage is coming from each fuel type, you know what this means to you. So if you know that electricity is the main source of fuel, this might be acceptable, or if you don't think this is the case, you might want to look at your consumption in more detail and think about how you can reduce your consumption at this site. So moving on now to the tables that will also be produced, and we can see here our emissions split across different sites. So we can see here that most of our emissions, 39%, are coming from site 3. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see that it's a similar picture when we look at monetary value, and that 44% of our bills are being spent at site 3. So depending what we know about the different sites, we know whether this is acceptable or not. So if we know that site 3 is far bigger than sites 1 and 2, this might be completely acceptable and something that we have to deal with. But if we know that this isn't the case, we need to look at things in a bit more detail. So it might be that sites 1 and 2 have had investments made into energy efficiency and site 3 hasn't. And now we've got this information here, we can really see that it was beneficial to input those energy efficiency measures, and we might consider making that investment at site 3. It might be that people using sites 1 and 2 have energy saving culture embedded in them, and they're making a real effort to not overconsume. So it's just about thinking what these sites are, what they mean to us, and what changes we might want to put in place. So now moving on to the 5-year summary. This will also be produced for us, and it gives us a better idea about our emissions and our costs over time. So if we zoom into the graph here, this shows our annual carbon emissions across the years, and it's also split and colour-coded across fuel types. So we can see here with the sample data, there was a significant reduction between 2017 and 2018, and then in 2019 it remains pretty much steady. So we might be able to identify any changes that were made between the 2 years, and we can really illustrate the actual effect that these changes have made. And then here we see this in terms of monetary value. So it's also always good to be able to see where you've saved money and really illustrate it through these graphs.
So just to give some greater context to where this all fits in May 2019, the States Assembly agreed that there exists a climate emergency, and that in order to deal with this, Jersey should aim to be carbon neutral by 2030. Since then, the carbon neutral strategy was produced and unanimously voted for in February 2020, which sets out 5 defining principles to shape Jersey's carbon neutral journey. I'd just like to point out Principle 4. We will make sure that everyone can play their part. This is about everyone, so local businesses, the government and the public, taking responsibility to have a fair and just transition to carbon neutrality. And then Principle 5, again, ensuring a just transition. We will make sure that carbon neutrality policies do not overall increase income inequality, but improve the standard of living here in Jersey. So, of course, there will be a cost associated with being carbon neutral, but the level of these costs and where the money should come from will be one of the key questions for the upcoming Citizens' Assembly on the climate emergency. We'll be looking to businesses and the public for involvement to help shape our future ambitions. So in terms of the Common Strategic Policy, this figure on the screen outlines the connection between the carbon neutral strategy and this policy, which comprises of 5 main principles. And the reason why they're in the shape of a circle is to highlight how all strategies interlink, in which the environment and business strategies are where your involvement as organisations come in to further support Principle 4 of the carbon neutral strategy, making sure everyone can play their part. So In terms of impacting the sustainable, vibrant economy, we hope to establish Jersey's reputation as a responsible, low-carbon jurisdiction. This will be done by working with organisations to support them to address their carbon footprint and promote sustainable ways of working, as well as protecting and valuing our environment by contributing to the global carbon reduction targets. So for some global context, Jersey has a lower per capita carbon emissions than many jurisdictions of a similar size, and actually has the lowest of all jurisdictions in the British Isles. So clearly Jersey is starting off in a really great and fortunate position. However, we do want to continue to lead by example and try and stay at the front of this race. So our elected representatives in the States Assembly, as well as leading businesses and many islanders, believe that we need to act faster, go further, and continue to use our privileged position to demonstrate what a concerted effort to decarbonise our island can look like.
Okay, so now taking a look at Jersey's emissions over time and considering how far we've got to go to reach that carbon neutral target. So way back in 2007, the UN Kyoto Protocol was extended to Jersey. This is a global treaty on climate change which requires Jersey to reduce its on-island carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, and this is relative to 1990 levels. So we were already on our carbon reduction journey even before our government declared a climate emergency in 2019. And our island has made great progress and emissions have fallen by 47% since 1990. However, there's still a huge way to go to reach carbon neutrality. The graph with the bubbles on the side here shows a comparative breakdown of emissions in each sector. So as you can see, the transport, business and residential bubbles account for huge percentages, and that's where we can make a real difference. If these are further broken down, we can see that this mainly comes from heating buildings and homes and road transport in particular. So it's really important for us to monitor and analyse our contributions, especially to these three main sectors.
So it's important to understand the causes and impacts of climate change and what you and your organisation can do to affect climate change. So when we refer to carbon emissions, these can also be referred to as scope emissions, which are broken down into 3 scopes. So just to explain them quite briefly, and then I'll go into more detail individually. But scope 1 emissions are our direct greenhouse gas emissions, for example, fuel combustion from driving your car. Scope 2, indirect greenhouse gas emissions from purchased electricity. And then scope 3 are indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with the manufacturing and transport of goods and services. So scope 1 emissions are the emissions that the island is directly responsible for that are generated from on-island activities. So, for example, the emissions from driving petrol or diesel cars or burning oil or gas to heat buildings. And so these are accounted for in our greenhouse gas reporting. And in terms of our international obligations, these are in line with the Kyoto Protocol, which currently extends only to our scope 1 emissions, which are monitored and independently validated and reported on an annual basis by the UK accredited auditor Ether. Then our scope 2 emissions are our indirect greenhouse gas emissions from purchased electricity. So those arising from the generation of any imported electricity, which we are indirectly responsible for. So in the case of Jersey, this includes the 95% of our electricity that we import from France. And in terms of global emissions accounting, it considers the emissions from energy production to accrue to the country in which it was generated. So in this case, the 95% of our electricity is accounted for in France's scope 1 emissions. But it's clear that these emissions are the result of energy use in Jersey. And then finally, scope 3 are indirect greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the emissions associated with the manufacture and transport of goods and services we consume, but occur at sources owned or controlled by another country. So this includes the full life cycle emissions throughout the supply chain, including those associated with the end of life or disposal of a product. So scope 3 emissions are purely driven by the choices and behaviours of Jersey residents and businesses, but are accounted for as scope 1 emissions in the country in which the greenhouse gas emissions were generated. But some examples include the energy that was used to manufacture your smartphone in China, or burning of marine diesel to ship, for example, a packet of tomatoes from Spain to Jersey, as well as aviation fuel consumed on your flight from Gatwick to Italy, for example, for a summer holiday. We actually can't measure scope 3 emissions, but pretty much everything we buy will have been manufactured elsewhere. So this is by far our biggest impact as an island. We're often asked, why should Jersey reduce emissions when we're a tiny island and places like China are massive producers? But we want to highlight that our goods are made elsewhere, so would be scope 1 emissions wherever they're made. And as a relatively wealthy island, we are big consumers. So by being conscious of our consumption, we have the potential to make a big impact on other countries' scope 1 emissions.
So here we have a prime example of monitoring on the island from the Radisson Blue Hotel on the waterfront. They're doing a phenomenal amount of monitoring, and they're actually monitoring every single day to see where they're using energy and where they're potentially wasting it, and whereabouts in their building that's coming from. So speaking to them was really interesting, as they found that particular rooms were using much more energy than others. There was one room in particular that when in use, they saw a huge increase in their energy consumption, and they were able to make decisions about when to use that room and when they might be able to use another room instead, which really helped them. The energy saving culture is ingrained in staff from when they begin their training, and it's something that they're really proud of.
So this is now just your opportunity to load up your spreadsheet and familiarise yourself with it, and to ask any questions if need be. Our contact details are at the end of this presentation slide, so feel free to contact us. But one of the first slides, energy bill guide, it just highlights the 3 pieces of information needed from your bills. So your bill date, the total energy used, and the total cost. And then these are just some examples of bills and just highlighting where the required information is. So you have your electricity, gas, oil, and petrol or diesel. And then this is the bill data entry sheet, which is one of the first sheets. You'll start off entering your data in terms of your energy consumption, but I'm going to pass you over to Jodie now, who's going to go into more detail about the spreadsheet.
Okay, so hopefully you can all see an example of the spreadsheet here, which you should all have. So the first sheet here, as Nadia said, is just a bit of an overview of energy monitoring, and we can click through to the different sheets at the bottom here. So then we've got the energy bill guide, which is quite useful to refer back to, just to check that with all the different numbers that you see here, you've got the right one to input into your sheet. So if we click into the first input sheet here for site 1, you can see that I've put in lots of different numbers just to give us an idea of what things should look like once we've got the information in. So it's important to be mindful of the units that are being used so that we make sure we get the right number in there. So for electricity, it's kilowatt hours and then the cost. The same for gas, kilowatt hours and then cost. For heating oil, it's quantity in litres and then cost, and that's the same for petrol and diesel. And then for air travel, it's CO2 in kilograms and the cost. Over here in the purple, we've got benchmark figures. So it's perfectly fine to leave this one blank. But if there was something that you know would be a useful benchmark for you, you can add it in there. So we've used the example here of number of rooms occupied. That could be number of staff using the site that month, or number of events that month, or anything really that you think would be useful. So just going in here, I'll do a little example of how we can use the sheet. So click into the cell that you'd like to input data for, type in whatever number it might be, so I'll just use the example of 10. Click across or use the arrows to move across and add in the other information there. If you've got multiple bills for the same month, please don't add in a new row as this can confuse the formulae, but instead add up using a calculator the total amount for that month. Or if you feel confident using Excel, you can do it within the cell. So moving along now using the arrows, we've got input site 2, just clicking into it there actually, sorry, and input site 3, 4 and 5. So if you've only got one site or it's not clear which bill's for which, it's perfectly fine to use site 1. Then if we look at the summaries here which are created for us, because I've input lots of data for 2017, I can get a good idea of the spend and the emissions across sites and get these graphs here, which should be familiar from the slides earlier. That's the same for 2018, but if we move into 2022, for example, which of course we don't have the data for, we can see it's blank and it will just appear magically once we put that information in. Then we've got the 5-year summary here, which you can see marks our use over time. And that's just a bit of an overview of how it all works. If you've got any questions about how this works, or you'd like some more information about the carbon factors or anything like that, then please get in touch.
But just loading up, here are our contact details if you have any further questions, like Jodie said. Yeah, thank you very much for listening, and we hope you find this tool useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.